Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever time it is that you inky savages are joining us for episode number 172 of the PenBoyRoy Pentertainment Podcast. So this week I have on for the fourth time in the history of the Pentertainment Podcast a guest that has been on several times. It is Mr. JJ Lax. We're excited to have him. And he is here to, I don't know what he's here to discuss, but he wanted to be on the show. And as a result, I'm just like, yeah, man. I love having you on the show. Having you on the show is awesome. So he's going to be with us after the sponsorship reads. So before we get started with this week's episode, we're going to talk a little bit about how much I love you guys for using the affiliate link in the description below, which gives you access to all the products on the Goldspot websites and gives you the chance to help out this multi-dozen-dollar corporation known as the Pentertainment Studios. Just be sure to use coupon code LUCY, as in I love Lucy, or more importantly, the Odd Oinks pup, Lucy, Lucy. Make sure to use coupon code Lucy at checkout for an additional savings on most of the products available on the Goldspot website, of course, through the affiliate link. Some exclusions do apply because some brands are just too snobby and think they're better than they are and won't allow discounts. I'm just kidding. I do that every time because there's a little hint of spite in there. Anyway. I also want to talk one more time, and I really am going to say that this is probably the last time we're going to talk about it, and the only reason why is because our good old friend Bryce over at Luxury Brands of America, he doesn't update the sponsorship reads, so whenever I ask him last minute, hey, what's the sponsorship read for this week, he has to come up with something, and since he still has about 10% of stock left of the Retro 51 Luxury Brands exclusive Tornado, the Rainforest, he said, you know what, might as well talk about that one again. What other pen is one of a kind like this pen? What other pen has a tree frog on the finial? What other pen has rainforest birds and critters all over the pen with leaves and stuff? It's a rollerball, comes in real handy. Sometimes there are situations in life where fountain pens are not the most practical or optimal writing instrument. And in that case, there is nothing better than to use the Rainforest Retro 51 Luxury Brands exclusive Tornado. As I said, it has animals of the rainforest wrapping around the pen and a tree frog perched on the finial. This Retro 51, and I mean this, is sure to be one of a kind, much different than all the other pens that have been described as one of a kind. But no, this one is genuinely and truly one of a kind. Now, most importantly, a portion of the proceeds from the purchase of this pen will be donated to the Rainforest Trust to help protect endangered animals and landscapes around the world. As you guys know, I am a huge animal lover. I can't resist a cat in the street, and I do have a new cat now. I'll talk about that later if JJ Lax is open to hearing about it after the sponsorships. But this pen, the Rainforest Retro 51 Luxury Brands exclusive Tornado, is limited to 500 individually numbered pieces worldwide, and you can purchase them directly at the link just given to you in the description below. It's luxurybrandsusa.com/product/retro51. That's a mouthful, so the link will be in the description below for you to easily click on it. And last, I want to just talk about this bad boy right here one more time because I got this in the mail.
Thanks, Roy.
Yeah, and I just love this thing. I haven't used it yet because it's like sacred. I'm going to litter this bad boy with stickers. But this is the InkJournal exclusive Endless Recorder. Now, it's not your standard dot grid recorder. It's not your standard notebook. This is designed exclusively for use for ink swashes and stuff. There's instructions for people like me who don't know how to use these types of notebooks. See, I'm not a big ink guy, but here you can put down information like swatch the color, and then you can put down the information of the pen, the nib, etc., etc. If you move later into the book, you have, hold on, I gotta sneeze. Okay.
Bless you.
Thank you. You have a generic bottle of ink that you can write stuff into. Then you have a outline of a fountain pen that kind of allows you to write down what pen, what nib you have. If you look over at Tom's, if you're watching, he has his filled out. And then you got these. You got an angry octopus, a decently moody octopus, and a happy octopus for whether you like this ink that you're using or not. So the majority of the book is this right here, just different inks that you can log. And then towards the back, you have what you see oftentimes on the Ink Journal Instagram page during 30 Inks 30 Days, where he draws out the squares on the dot grid. Well, these are pre-drawn out for you, because knowing how to draw a square and outline the square is not really essential to 30 Inks 30 Days, but this does it for you. If you're kind of like a person like me who is just too lazy to draw squares, because that's a thing, too lazy to draw squares. These are already done for you. It saves you the time of drawing the square or messing up the square or mismeasuring the number of dots to make the square. And then you can do your ink swatch there. Do you have a sample you can show them of your
No, because I have not engaged in a 30 Inks 30 Days challenge yet. But when that comes up in September, that's what I'll be using for it. So
okay. Yeah. So this is one of the Odd Oink's favorite colors. It is like a cerulean blue, turquoisey type blue. Hopefully it doesn't get keyed out in the green screen. But
I don't think so.
If you want to check out what this is used for, you can check out the Ink Journal Instagram page, and it's always littered with all kinds of ink stuff because it's Ink Journal. These notebooks are available exclusively at inkjournal.com for $27. Get yours today. Okay, so that's all I have for the sponsorships. We're really excited to talk with our good friend JJ Lax, who's a really smart guy, and I'm outnumbered by the number of beards. You'll see what I mean after the intro. But before we get started with this week's episode, I want to give you guys a quick disclaimer. This podcast is not scripted and therefore will contain potty mouth words, both from Tom and I, mostly from me, maybe from JJ. Who knows? We'll see. It's an exciting event. We haven't had this much fun in a long time. I'm looking forward to it. So just be forewarned. You have been warned. Now on to the podcast.
The PenBoyRoy Pentertainment Podcast. Stay savage.
So today we have JJ Lax. We're excited to have you here. Just do me a favor, JJ. Pay attention to your framing and try to center yourself. Just scooch over to your right. All right. So today we had
to coordinate.
Yeah, stop. That's
like
it.
That?
Too much.
Perfect.
Too much. All right, perfect. You're good. All right. So, like I said, we have JJ Lax while Tom is getting hammered and I'm drinking coffee. So Tom is drinking what looks like a dark beer. He claims that it's not, but I'm not going to.
It is not.
Yeah, sure. Coffee. Got it.
It's
anyway,
coffee.
Yeah, JJ Lax is here. We've had JJ Lax on before, and we've always had a lot of fun with him. So when he reached out to me and said he had stuff to talk about, I didn't even ask him, hey, man, what do you have to talk about? Because I truly don't give a shit. I just want him on the show because he's a lot of fun. So, JJ, how have you been? It's been a while.
Yeah, I'm great. I have one question, though, before we get into it, which is if I reach 5 times, do I get the Penboy Pentertainment Podcast coat like they give the 5-timers on Saturday Night Live?
I didn't know that. I didn't know that. I don't watch Saturday Night Live. I thought I didn't know that they're still doing shows.
They are. Well, up until this season, they were doing it. I guess now everyone's on strike, whether you're a performer, writer, or whoever you are. Because the directors caved. We don't need to get into the labor dispute of Hollywood, but you know.
I can send you something. It might not be a jacket. I could send you.
Well, we depleted our entire supply of shirts.
Right.
So that's kind of out of the window.
I got them.
Yeah?
We gotta think of something
at the Long
extra.
Island show where we were all together.
Oh yeah,
I left them out on the table. I took 3, 1 for me and 2 for the boys.
I can't believe that you're not wearing them for the show. You'd be the only one, actually.
I thought that would be tacky to have it on. Like
Is
I
there
needed
anything...
something else. Like it's like going to right? Like it'd be like too D-bag type behavior.
No,
to wear your T-shirt to your show. I needed to do something different. I think. Am I wrong? Is that? I'd love to know in the comments below what people think.
I love the engagement. I do think you're wrong. I think everybody else will agree.
Okay.
And even if they don't agree, what they really mean is that they agree. That's how I'll interpret everything that people say, if it's in disagreement. I'm just kidding. But yeah, anyway, good to see you again, brother. What do you got? What do you got? What do you got for us today?
Well, I'd like to start with an exercise, if you will.
Okay.
I'd like you to imagine a world where everybody uses fountain pens for all writing that's not done on a keyboard or a typewriter or something like that, right? Can you picture a world like that, right?
Okay.
Okay.
Oh,
Right?
what a wonderful
Now,
world.
but what if I told you you could still get into that world in some way? You could still have a piece of that world without actually going back in time in some interesting Michael J. Fox type format, right?
Okay.
And
That would
why
be
do I
great.
say this? Why would I say this, right? And I'll say that one of your recent podcasts that I was listening to as I was working on pens inspired me to think a little bit more about this. So that's why I wanted to come here and talk about it. But what I want to talk about is vintage pens.
Okay.
And, I'm going to use the term vintage loosely, anything that's old, right? So, like, for example, again, going back to that podcast, Roy, you talked about getting that, like, Schaefer Balance 2, I think it was, at the most recent Long Island show, right? That, to me, is somewhat of a vintage pen. Like, granted, it could have been made, there
Oh,
it is.
wow.
It could have been made in the 90s, but, it's still going back to an earlier age that's over, right? Because like Schaefer, Parker, Waterman, kind of the names we all know, like the form that they exist in today it was not when that pen was made. Like that Schaefer Balance 2 is like
What do you mean when you say
yeah,
the form that they exist in today? Can you clarify what that means?
sure. So like for example, Schaefer, right? Schaefer maintained its US factory until like a little more than 20 years ago, right?
Okay.
That closed. And then Schaefer, the brand, has gone through several iterations, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just different, right? And so, like, they were owned by Cross for a bit of time. Private equity, I think, had them. Now they're owned by a company called William Penn in India, and they are now coming back to the U.S. after a few years of not being in the U.S. market. It's just a different company, right? Like I have an Onoto that I got, right? There's a Onoto that you could get today made in England, but there's an Onoto that existed in another time and place that is the modern pens kind of reference, but it's just not the same thing. So so when I say vintage, I'm talking about kind of like the end, anything that was made kind of to the end of the heyday of fountain pens. So like whatever existed from that heyday is sort of like different now. Before that change took place, that's what we'll
Okay,
talk
so
about loosely.
you're saying anything that existed to the heyday of fountain pens. So let's
From
establish from. Okay,
yeah,
so let's establish the end of the heyday
sure,
in your perspective, so that we have more of a structured idea of what you consider vintage.
yeah, right, okay. So one of the great things, and we'll get more into this about why this matters in a little bit, but right, so fountain pens as we know it, meaning the object that can hold its own ink supply, right? Because there's dip pens, which a lot of folks love for calligraphy, things like that. There's a beautiful antique versions. Some of those companies that made them became fountain pen manufacturers, like maybe Todd, I think, is one of them. But really, what a fountain pen is, right, is it's that style of pen, but it holds its own ink supply. And I think that the convention is that around 1880, sort of that started. Lewis Waterman filed the first patent. There's some historical debate about that by the people who are super into this, which we'll leave it to them to explain. But that's basically that's the start of fountain pens, right? And then if you think about, so that started in like the Industrial Revolution. And fountain pens then went through all the aesthetic and industrial eras that existed up until basically the 80s and 90s, right? And starting probably in the 90s, and again, people who are experts on this, and I will tell you I don't consider myself a vintage pen expert. I just am an enthusiast. And that's why I want to talk about it like that today. The people who the sort of the companies and the makers that like existed from that heritage that started in the 1880s and kind of ran through the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, like those brands, a lot of them, I think really the big shift is like late 80s into 90s, right? Like at some point, like Parker and Waterman and Rotring, which is a German brand, were all purchased by like Sanford, and like they became different companies. They just have it, and some of the pens they make look similar, but it's just a different company. And so that's where, so that period, I guess I'm talking about is theoretically 1880 all the way to say 1997 or something like that, 1999. right?
Okay, so for the sake of this conversation, to you, vintage is anything before the 1990s,
Yeah, let's say that, because there's a pen called the Parker 75, right?
right?
That is like considered by some like the last great vintage pen, right? Again, these are subjective terms, meaning people make their own conclusion and judgment about it, and then we'll say it, right? Is that the last vintage pen? I can't tell you that. I don't know if anyone can, but that's something that you hear sometimes. The last great vintage pen, um, and that was basically an 80s pen, the aesthetics, everything, 70s, 80s pens, like thin, metallic body, sort of like narrow nib, not really like that classic kind of flare out with the shoulders that we tend to think about as a nib. And so, yeah, so that's sort of like the time frame. And why am I putting the time frame? And why is the Josh Lax view of the world taking this shape, right? I will tell you. The reason is because I want. There's a lot of great people in the fountain pen community that were not there when I started being what I would say, I guess, collecting, what you might just call it, addicted, acquiring, enthusiast, whatever, fanatic. Um, what I remember going to a fountain pen show was you walk around and there'd be a lot of white men, mostly white men, kind of wanted to tell you what's special about whatever they had on their table. And they didn't care what you know or didn't know. They just wanted to talk to you about it, right? As a younger person, that was my experience. We pivoted away from that in a great way. It's so much more diverse. The age, the age range, the cultural backgrounds, the race, everything is so gender. It's so much more diverse, right? And a lot of people have found their way into it a lot through great modern pens and people who are being creative in different ways. And there's a lot of great companies that are like crushing it. Like right now you could find at any price point like an amazing pen, right? Like a very reliable pen from all over the world. But what's another special thing that's out there, if you're really into pens and you want to experience something kind of new perhaps or different than what a lot of modern pens offer, is this world of vintage. But I'm a big tent person when it comes to this, obviously, so I'm giving it the broadest possible reading, because you could go, let's say, right, like it's using the Schaefer Balance 2, which is again the pen that Roy got in Long Island, right? That is based on, there's a reason it's the Schaefer Balance 2. There was an earlier Schaefer Balance, which was a pen in the 20s through the 40s that was made out of celluloid. It was the same shape. Some of them were bigger, some of them were smaller, some of them were black, some of them were patterned. They all had gold nibs. The gold nibs are like, very hard to find flexible ones, and we can get to flex at some point in our conversation because it's sort of inevitable, but like that so if you find yourself going, so I try, you find yourself, oh, here's the Schaefer Balance 2, super cool. What is the Schaefer Balance 1 about? And then you go and you explore that a little bit. You're going to find something that's super well made, super cool, celluloid, which has a huge premium now, but for vintage stuff, you can find celluloid pens at a very reasonable amount. With a nib that is probably going to stand the test of time because it is a thick piece of gold with a good solid tipping, and the whole pen is super reliable, right? And so that's why I want the broadest way. So just you start with basically the idea of you're going to buy someone else's pen or some group of people's pens, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like, what is that experience gonna bring you? And so that's why I came on the show today. Also to rack up my stats so I get whatever the fifth timer sticker or what have you. So
okay, so you wanted to talk about vintage pens and basically just to tell me if I'm missing anything, to summarize in a way.
Yeah.
We kind of just established what is vintage to you.
Yeah.
Right. And you kind of touched on how vintage pens, or rather pens that are vintage but less vintage, can be a gateway into more vintage pens. So you use the Schaefer Balance 2 as an example. You said, oh, somebody might be intrigued by the Schaefer Balance 2 and then therefore go into the Schaefer Balance 1, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So What brought on this urge to talk about this? Not that you need a reason.
There's a couple of different reasons. So first of all, it's again going back to my early time in this interest, right? And who are the people that were around, right? They tend to be older, right? And there's a lot of really friendly, really knowledgeable people that are now going into their later years. And this will sound like, there is an agenda, which is basically to say that we're in danger in a way of losing some of that as a community because people are not just not as interested in it anymore. And so obviously the emphasis, and I mean, you kind of need it, right? The economics of the pen business need constant demand on these companies, right? And so that's good. But one of the consequences that comes out of that is that if the focus is a lot on acquiring or purchasing vintage pen or non-vintage pens, sort of recent manufacture pens, right? Sort of the interest wanes, but there's like a lot of people that have spent a lot of time, decades, like really into it. And so one thing is for them to kind of just like find ways to preserve what they were really about when it came to fountain pens. Second is, and it's at a great time to jump into vintage fountain pens for that reason as well. You think about like, okay, I'm going to buy a vintage pen, right? You could think of like the immaculate Waterman 58 Red Ripple, right? So the 58 is like the large model, if those don't know, right? So Waterman, big company, continues to exist today. I actually would submit that their modern stuff is just as good, although different, but I really like it. But the 50, so they had different sizes, right? And the 58 was the biggest, and it's sought after because of the size, and it's a little rarer, right? But you could think about like, okay, I'm going to go out and buy a Waterman 58, and you could go shopping for it in some fashion, and you could be looking for like a perfect metal clip, and the cap band, the metal part on the base of the cap, that's in great shape, right? And that the ebonite is not discolored or anything like that. So, you could go trying to find things like that. But the reality is that's going to be what is almost inaccessible for a lot of people because that's like a museum piece, what I'm describing. But there may be things like it or the same model in much less optimal condition for, say, like someone who's just collecting. That is a joy to use. In fact, if you all know Steve Light, who actually does children's books with fountain pens. He's here in New York City. Great guy if you ever encounter him. But like he uses Waterman 58s, and he has like a bunch of user Waterman 58s that he saw over the years.
How old is the Waterman 58?
Again, so here's where my expertise wane. I believe
just roughly.
I would say like it's like a 20s model, right? So we're talking now like 100 years old, but they still. I hear typing, so I think someone's
that's
me on
right.
this.
No, we just look up stuff when nobody's.
No, that's
I
good.
look up stuff here
because I'm just spitballing. So someone needs to back me on the facts. But so and why am I saying this in this context? Talking about say a lesser condition or something like that. Well, the thing is, the people who have spent years acquiring and collating piles of pens, because there was a time where people could go to a garage sale and buy a garbage bag of pens for $20 and it would have these things in it, right? Those people now are at the point in their life where having all of this makes little sense for various reasons. They're not going to gift a whole pile of pens to their loved ones. They're going to give them the best stuff, right? So people are going to start to let this stuff go, and it's going to be let go at a pretty reasonable price relative to other things. So there's like a financial opportunity that can't go overlooked. So I'll give you an example of that in real life. So I went to the St. Louis Pen Show a couple weeks ago. It was it's a very well-run show, but it just doesn't get the foot traffic that some of the other shows around the country get. And so there's people there looking to unload things. And so, like, for example, I got a vintage Mont Blanc with a flexible double broad oblique nib that has an ebonite, like the old school ebonite feed. It might be a little bit of a Frankenhead. But the clip, whoever had this originally, the clip broke, and they replaced it with an Osmia clip, which was another big vintage German brand that makes great pens. So it's a good clip. but it's just not the full Mont Blanc, right? I got this thing for $50. If it wasn't, complete and it's writing, I just filled it and flushed it out. Like it, and so that, you can get things like that. And so you can begin to sort of get a feel for what it is. And so I'm part of a larger group of folks that are trying to kind of preach the what's the best way to put it? Not like preach, but like spread the word about why you should give vintage pens a chance if for some reason you shied away from them for some reason.
So it sounds to me like you're not really saying give vintage pens a chance. You're saying give vintage pens that aren't in A+ shape a chance.
I mean, that's a decision some people will want the A+ shape, right? And that's great. Go for it. But I'm saying that if the idea that things are not in A+ shape perhaps has been something that's put you off or made you reticent to get involved or to take the plunge on something that maybe seems like, the deal is too good to be true, or there's just something about it that makes you feel uncomfortable or you don't want to do it. I'm trying to get people to go over the hump and just say, yeah, you know what? I'll give it a shot because, the upshot of this is if I like it, might be really cool, and the other thing I'll say, and this is going to sound like kind of like, I don't even know, you'll think of a good word for it. There's a certain aspect to it where like you get to have like a writing experience that doesn't exist anymore. And you kind of like find out what a fountain pen felt like to write with 60 years ago. To me, is kind of like a cool experience, and there's not much in our world, like how many of us can go like hop in a vintage car and go for a ride and like a Tin Lizzie, right? But you can do that with a pen.
I see your point there and I can totally relate to that because there were times where we write with Yovo nibs, we write with Bach nibs, and everybody uses Yovo and Bach, and then every once in a while you get something unique like a Lamy or an in-house made nib. And I think what you're saying, and I agree with it if this is what you're saying, the number of flavors are limited in modern times, and there's a different flavor that has been there and we have access to it. It just, you got to be open-minded to give it a shot.
Yeah.
I think that before I, talk about this, I want to tell you where I stand when it comes to vintage pens. I can live with them and I can live without them, right? Okay. So if I see one I like, I'll buy it. What makes the standard of something I like depends on the situation, right? So for example, if I'm buying a Schaefer Balance 2, which you considered vintage in the beginning of the show, and it's in A+ shape, I'll buy it. If it's not, I won't. And the reason why is because if I buy a vintage pen that's not in A+ shape and I need to get some corrections done on it, the process of getting corrections done on it or getting repairs done on it is not as streamlined with counterparts that are modern, right? So like, I buy a modern, Monteverde pen, something's wrong with it. All it is mail it in and I get another one back. I'm no way comparing the modern Monteverde with vintage. I'm just using that as an example. But I see your point, but also I think when you're saying, hey, everybody, give vintage pens a shot is one thing. I agree with that. I don't think people should exclude vintage pens, but at the same time, I think you're on a tightrope when you're telling people, hey, give the ones that aren't in the best shape a shot, because you're telling them now to invest their money in something where they may have no recourse if something goes wrong, right? And then, sure, you could offer me all these options, like go to this guy, go to this guy, go to this guy, go to this guy. This guy's good at repair. You yourself, Josh, are very good at repair. What's the turnaround, right?
Yeah.
Why would somebody opt for that if modern fountain pens don't give them that turnaround time or the potential risk of spending money from a vendor who is not completely and totally good? Tom, go ahead. You have your hand up.
Tom,
Sorry.
we should come back to this though, because there's some things to say about that.
Well,
you raised a good concern, and this is why we're having the conversation to talk about concerns.
did want to put maybe like an economic perspective on it.
Yeah.
So what you're saying before, JJ, is that you had gotten a really great deal, $50 for a Mont Blanc with a flexible nib, ebonite feed, and sure, clip had to be replaced, and it probably wasn't in the greatest of shape, but it was $50. You spend $50 these days on anything, and you're just getting an ordinary run-of-the-mill Yovo nib. You're getting, injection molded plastic maybe, and so on and so forth. So my kind of like my counter to Roy's argument about the fact that there's no recourse because these pens were made very long ago. They're not in warranty. There's not an easy place where you could just go and send it and get it replaced or fixed, because all this stuff is, there are ways to get it fixed if you have a filling system issue or whatever. It's not just simple as just buying a different converter or cartridge to put in it, but at the same time, you only spent $50 on it. If you did need to put some money into, let's say, fixing a bladder or a lever fill or a vacuum, the diaphragm on something, or fixing a nib, that's what JJ's point, I think, is that kind of getting into vintage. If you could get a great value on it, then you might be able to just do a little bit of adjustment here or there, and then have it be an amazing pen that then is worth, let's say, 5 times the amount that you put into it. Possibly.
I agree with that. And more than just it's worth 5 times more, it's something that you enjoy and you like, right? So I definitely see that point 100%. Like, for example, you buy a vintage pen, you spend pennies on it, and then you turn it into something where it's fulfilling its goal as being an awesome pen. I agree with that 100%. That's a very valid point. My thing is just that in order to get to that point, how many times do you have to fail before you get there? And a lot of times people sell vintage stuff online. It's happened to me. And you spend $50, and then it turns out that $50 wasn't worth the $50 because the pen you got was a dud. And then you try to get it fixed. You spend a few more dollars on it. And even though you got it fixed, it still is not where it should be. And then the experience becomes soured. And then what happens to some people, like what happened to me, is, like I said, I'm not for or against vintage. I am against the experience of wasting money. But then you become more cautious and guarded about spending money on those things, right? It's like there's no standard of being able to buy something. Like right now, you buy a pen at Goldspot. There is certainly a standard that I can rely on in terms of customer service and warranty, even if the brand goes out of business, right? So I buy a pen 2 years later, they go out of business and I have a problem with it. I reach out to Goldspot. They'll be like, all right, so we can't get it fixed, but maybe they'll work with you. Vintage, there's nothing else. There's nothing like that unless you buy it from Fountain Pen Hospital or something like that.
So what I would say is a couple things. So first of all, I get that what you're talking about is a certain buying experience that's has a lot of convenience, right? And I also recognize that what I'm talking about requires that someone who starts to look at these things, depending on what it is, because it's not always the case, start to learn a little bit about what they're going after. And in some ways, you kind of need to do that because there's just so much out there that you might want to know a little bit about, like, what are the key things. And there's some good ways to do that, which we could get to in a second. Second, there are these things, if they're kicking around now, a lot of them are very well made. And yeah, they may have little problems. We'll get to some of the problems too in a second. But the thing is that a lot of them last pretty well. And so it may be a little beat up, but like it's kind of what Tom's saying, you are getting some of that value, even if you're paying a low price. Now, so what is there to kind of understand about the lay of the land that affects like the purchasing process that Roy, you very eloquently laid out, right? So the first thing is, right, to understand.
I said something eloquent?
You did. It was very eloquent. I was moved. I don't know about you, Tom. I see tears kind of coming through on Tom's thing, but I don't know if that's wanting.
That's
to
just
being.
I was cutting onions. It's cutting on you.
That was sweat from drinking too much beer.
Yeah.
It's my beer sweat.
Whatever time it is on a Saturday afternoon. So what is it that you kind of got to know if you're going to go check this stuff out? So the thing obviously is different brands had different filling systems, right? The idea of a cartridge did not come into real use in any real way until like the latter period of what I was talking about before, like 60s and 70s.
Okay.
Now, that being said, again, if you're interested in kind of seeing some of the stuff, you can find things that don't have the complexity that the earlier stuff does. And that's again a relative term. We talk about that. But so basically,
you're talking about filling mechanisms. What you're saying is if you're looking for something that's vintage but is less complex than having like a sack or something, or has cartridges, you can find that. Now, Mike, just really quick, I'm sorry, but you're in a way implying that issues with vintage pens exist more with filling mechanisms versus those with cartridges, because right? So you're saying that there's less issues because otherwise, what's the point of separating them in this conversation?
The point of separating is that, you were highlighting like the issue of I plunk down money on this thing that looks super cool. And then from there, things got to happen to it in addition to the buying process. Like, I can't just ink it up and start writing and letting people try it and take pictures of it. There's some upkeep, right? And so the first thing I wanted to address was that like there are vintage pens that are basically, vintage, come from the 60s, 70s, really well made, but basically have like a converter that goes in it, or you can get cartridges that still fit. Like this is a Schaefer. This is what they call the squeeze converter. These things last a very long time. You can still buy them because there's old stock kicking around, but it's as easy as like any other pen, right? And for this one, again, this was not an expensive purchase for me, but like it's like
beautiful nib,
14K, super broad. I love broads.
Right.
Both pens and otherwise.
I'm sorry, just really quick. So when I was talking about that buying experience, right, and things going wrong, I didn't actually mention filling system. So I'm not making a distinction between the two because I've bought vintage pens that don't have a filling system, uses cartridges that turn sour for me. And again, I'm not against vintage pens, but I don't think that the issues I'm talking about is exclusive to pens with filling mechanisms. I think that pens without internal filling mechanisms also are included in that. For example, I had two experiences, one with a Conklin crescent filler, which had its own filling mechanism. That one had issues, and then I had I forgot the name of the brand, one from the 60s that was a problem, and it was a cartridge converter, and something to do with like the feed or the little pipe that goes into the cartridge or something like that was a problem. And then recently a friend of mine, he bought a vintage, I read the email a couple of weeks ago. It's a cartridge converter, and it still had a problem. So I think
what do you mean by problem? Because let's define what that is.
So his pen would burp or keep dripping, right?
Okay.
And then the one that I had, there was a fracture in the grip section where the feed feeds into. So it would leak, basically. So basically just little things like that. But my point is the issue that I talk about when it comes to the buying experience isn't exclusive to those vintage pens with filling mechanisms.
I got what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, what I would say is sort of the same thing, though, which I kind of started with, which is that it is not, recognize that it's not the same buying experience, right? And so depending on what the pen is, right, and who you're buying it from and things like that, and what you're willing to take in as risk, right? Because it's sort of like a risk-reward thing. I think we're all kind of dancing around is that, are you willing to take a risk on it, right? Is the price for what it is, if it works out with relative ease, good? Or is the price with whatever work needs to go into it, is it worth it to you, right? So there is a difference, right, than buying a modern pen. Now, with all that said, I don't know if, like latent defects, I get what you're saying. It's much harder if there's a latent, what I mean by latent defect, meaning
Mhm.
something that's in a problem that you can't see, but nonetheless exists, that's going to affect things. If that is there, yes, it does become maybe more of a headache. Um, so, what does that mean? Again, if you're interested in it, and I encourage everyone to at least check some of this stuff out and look online at pictures and read a little bit about it, is if you're interested in trying something, you got to learn a little bit about it, and then you
Mhm.
got to make sure you feel good about the person you're buying the pen from. So there's a whole, it's the same kind of like stuff that you might have to do if you're making a purchase that you're not sure about. Just think about if you want it. I don't want people to go out in the next 6 months, go hog wild for vintage pens, and then be completely distraught over the experience.
Mhm.
My hope is to help people in some way find a little bit of dexterity with it, so that, do I use too many big words, by the way? I'm becoming very
No.
self-conscious. All right, good. All right. So do you get to feel their way a little bit by starting small, right? Starting simple. And there's some models that are more reliable for, like, in terms of you get them right out of the dealer's hand. They're more likely to work for you better than something else because it does have some more complications. But
Mhm.
again, I go back to, yeah, like people have experiences with it. They are overall very durable. So, there's some fragility, right, with some things that are 80 to 100 years old. But, again, I could just start picking up pens that are in front of me and start talking about them, which I don't want to do because I don't want to get lost in the weeds. But there's a fair number of them that are pretty good, and, that, and you can make it work. Now, on that last point, making it work, right? The other thing is that for relatively low cost, you can learn to do some of this yourself, right? So if it is something that interests you, like to change a sack, which literally means like in the body of the pen connected to the base of the section is a sack that's shellacked there. It's like a glue type material. It's not that complicated to change that, right? And you can learn to do it if you want to, right? It's a personal choice. I always looked at it, if you like vintage pens, it was like the equivalent of like learning to change a tire. If you drive a car, you should know how to change a tire. You should learn how to change a sack. Now, on the flip side, there's some great pens that take a little more know-how to do, and some things that are kind of like at the upper echelons. And if you want that experience, like, yes, you got to accept that there's going to be some costs involved. So, for example, let's say you love, and I forget, Tom may have to give me the name of this model, the narwhal with the plunger filler,
The
right?
original plus.
Yeah, is that what it's called? The original plus,
Mm-hmm.
right? I call it the FU Philip Lim. The,
You know what though? Can I just chime in on that? Can I just
yeah,
chime in on that? Here's the thing. I remember when Twisby was going after Narwhal because Twisby was alleging that Narwhal copied
yeah,
Twisby, and I remember that whole conversation we had, and I'm like,
yeah,
fuck that guy from Twisby. Fuck him. What a dickhead.
yeah.
Narwhal didn't copy Twisby. And then you show me that pen, and that fucking pen by Narwhal looks like an exact copy of a Twisby. And that
Thing
happened
with
after. Yeah,
right,
I'm like, what? It's like, I was here on the defensive end of Narwhal because I'm like, man, you didn't copy Twisby. And then they're
yeah.
like, yeah, we're going to fight for, our stance. And then like 2 months later, they come out with a pen that looks exactly like a Twisby.
I mean, so the part of me that I would push back on it, I don't know if it is exactly like a Twisby. It has its own design features, and they
Oh,
clearly
sure,
want,
I know. And
but
I'm being
yeah,
sarcastic, but no joke though, when you held that up, I really thought it was
yeah,
Twisby.
Oh,
yeah.
come
No, I
on
hear you.
now. I saw that. I was right there. I know what difference is. Come on.
Yeah, there you go. So all right, so going back to the pen, the FU Philip Lim, right?
Right.
The With that, right? Let's say you love that idea, and then maybe you and you look at the Viscontis and you say, oh, the Visconti makes something like that, but it's $800, $900.
Mm.
And although, well, that's just not true because they do have less expensive models, but whatever. And you say, okay, but what if I told you that like people have been making that plunger filler style filling system since like the 30s. And so you could get a Schaefer plunger, or you can get an Onoto, which I mentioned earlier, like my pen, that, Winston Churchill was using a version of that when he was fighting in South Africa, or a journalist in South Africa in 1901, right? Like, there's a lot of vintage precedents for some of these things, right? But what I would tell you is, yes, you can get that, but like if you buy a $30 Schaefer plunger filler, which you could do, odds are is you're going to have somebody go in and fix it, because there's just no way that, unless it was recently restored, there's just no way that's going to be. But so from that, I would say, yeah, like to me, it's a really cool pen. It's like a really interesting pen, and the experience of it. And I can tell you, I have a vintage Onoto that I restored myself. It was not super easy, but it wasn't like overly complicated. The Schaefer is more complicated for reasons we can save for another conversation. But like it's really cool to be able to get something like that working. But you want it's right? Like I recognize that you want to do that. My big pitch to the pen world is that if you've shied away from it for some concerns, just take another look, in the sense that there's something out there that will appeal to you. And yeah, maybe ultimately for whatever reason, it's inaccessible. You don't like the cost. You're worried about the risk. You read online that like some part of it is prone to cracking or something like that. And yeah, like leave it behind. But it just is like there is another world out there that I think that people are aware of, but like for various reasons don't really, feel comfortable or have the inclination to like jump into. But you can get really cool stuff sometimes,
Yeah,
like
sure.
really great pens.
I really think that that's a valid thing to pitch to people, because what you're also giving them is you're giving them another depth to the hobby, right? So like someone like me, I got into fountain pens with modern fountain pens. I didn't really get into vintage fountain pens.
Yeah,
I'm still not into vintage fountain pens. Like I said, I could live with it, I could live without it. But I can see why getting into vintage is now a new dimension within the hobby of fountain pens, right? It's kind of like you're into cars.
Yeah.
Now you're into vintage cars, right? So it's kind of like the same thing. Like let's say you're into pop music, right? Like take a step back and listen to the Beatles and learn about the Beatles. And then you'll see and have a greater appreciation of modern music, of modern rock at least, because most of modern rock is somehow affected by the Beatles, right? So I definitely see that. I definitely can, however, see that getting into vintage for a lot of people is intimidating, because like you said, you have to know about it. You have to do research on it. You have to learn about it and stuff like that. And I think that with any hobby, though, you have to learn and research and do stuff, right? Mm-hmm. But I think the issue is with this new hobby within a hobby in vintage fountain pens, is since there's a greater risk of spending money and not having that money return on your investment, I think people can be intimidated by that.
Well, I would want to see about removing some of the roadblocks that then would prevent somebody from being more into this. And one of the things I could think of is being able to have resources, because I know that there's folks like JJ who work on nibs particularly, who also have a good knowledge of vintage pens. In my journey in vintage, I had sent several pens to Aaron Svabik of Penteeks.com. And I've been happy with his service. And I had a few pens. I got through a phase of like I was buying a whole bunch of things on eBay, and sometimes because I weighed the risk and reward, it was a cheap auction. Pictures weren't that great, but it was a pen that I really wanted. And if it worked out, it was going to be a big windfall, because if the pictures were good and the condition was excellent, I would have saved like $100, $200. So if I spend $30 on that pen, sending it to somebody to repair the filling system or adjust the nib, not a big deal in the overall, case of things. So I think having the resources of being able to get yourself out of a situation, even if you did get into a bad pen that has a couple of issues with it, I think would go a long way in getting people more amenable to getting into vintage pens and doing the research into that.
Yeah. I just also have to say that I think that there needs to be an understanding of what you're getting into. Like, for example, if you're going to buy a vintage pen, you have to be accepting of the fact that you may have to spend an extra $30, $50, maybe even $100 on getting it restored. But at the same time, if you are not financially capable, then I wouldn't say that this is the best idea right now. I think the best idea would be just stick with a lower end, low cost, reliable pen like a Pilot Metropolitan. Enjoy that.
Mm-hmm.
There's no pressure for you to get into this vintage thing. But if you're able to, it's definitely giving you a new dimension and perspective into the hobby. I do appreciate that about vintage pens. And that's why I get stuff like the Schaefer Balance.
Yeah.
And to your point, JJ, there's nothing like the Schaefer Balance that exists on the market today, right? And there's pens that look similar and stuff like that, but there's a je ne sais quoi about this pen, the nib, the way it writes, right? That really doesn't, like a Yovo nib, as much as I love Yovo, cannot emulate it.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point again, Jay, it's a $200 vintage pen. I'm willing to buy it because the risk, the reward of how it writes, and this one I got from a guy named Dan at the Long Island Pen Show, is worth the risk. Because let's say it didn't write or anything like that, or the nib was messed up, then I'd have to mail this out to JJ and have him fix it, and then have him send it back, right? And pay whatever his fee is. But like you said, Tom, at the end, I'll be happy with the product that I got, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if I wanted to buy a modern pen that had the same pedigree, I'd be spending $350, maybe $400. But
easily.
In this case, I only spent $200. I got lucky. This one knocks it out of the ballpark. It writes perfectly. So the risk was definitely worth the reward. But it is a gamble, and if you're getting into it, you have to just be aware that there is loss potential.
Yeah, I mean, let me just say, and I'm glad Tom raised this, which is the resources, right? So, there's things that exist out there that are very good. So first of all, Richard Binder has richardspens.com. He has he created his own diagrams of things and explains the basics of stuff. And if you want to read about how you go about fixing some of the stuff yourself, just because you want to know, it's there. Second is there's some good books. In particular, there's a book that called I think it's called Pen Repair 4th edition, which is they're on the 4th edition. Takes pictures of all this stuff and lays it out and gives you explanations. But I think that even that stuff can be a little inaccessible because it's sort of deep down the rabbit hole, super wonky things. And so what I'm fixing to do, we're doing two things. So first of all, I got a group of people together. We're going to do a panel in DC, talk about how to actually make that leap without making yourself crazy, right? So just where to start at a very basic level in a very broad way, right? Next, what I'm fixing to do is, and I've started kind of experimenting with making my own stuff and throwing up on Instagram, but I'm going to actually do some sort of YouTube channel where I'm going to work with various people, and it won't always be me. We'll pair people up, which is a dream I've had for years to do this, and have sort of old generation, new generation come together and just give people a quick down and dirty look at some of these things. So you get a little quick understanding, 5 minutes, throw on the video between PenBoyRoy episodes, and, you learn maybe something you didn't know before. The next time you go to a show or you're somewhere shopping, antique store or whatever, and you see something, you're oh, I know what that is, and you take a look at it and maybe it interests you. Things like that, right? Because again, I recognize like you could go hog wild, buy a fishing vest, and become like an old timer at one of these shows, like really into it really quickly. But that's really not who I'm trying to talk to. What I want to talk to the people that like love Leonardo pens, which are great pens, super cool pens. But did you know that if you look at Italian pens from the 30s, 40s, 50s, you're going to see where Leonardo's DNA comes from.
Mm.
And if you can go get your hands on one, even if you don't buy it, because some of them can be kind of expensive, just kind of see like what a pen company in Florence was making in the 50s or in the
That's
30s.
a very good point, and I like the direction that that's going, because like I was using before when it comes to like music and modern rock. Like, look at the roots, and I think that's a great thing that you're trying to do and put out there. I do think that you have very strong arguments for this. Not that there's an argument. I mean, like I said, I'm not for or against it, but I do have a question that I want to ask you. All right, and we're going to get to that right after this short pee break. I think a lot.
All right, good.
Well, I wish I knew what that.
I had to pick it up.
I wish I knew what that question was, Roy. Maybe I could ask him while you're
it'd
gone. Jeez, he just doesn't think of these things. Poor host of his own podcast, I tell you.
Yeah.
Just terrible.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the old adage, when you gotta go, you gotta go.
Pretty much. But this panel that you have at DC, who else is on the panel?
So we have Paul Arano, who publishes the Found Pen Journal, and it's just
the Grand Poobah.
The Grand Poobah himself. So this is in part a little bit. We're not sponsored because we're not taking any money, but this is in part put on by the Black Pen Society, which is essentially him. There's a fellow named Mike Daigle, which some people might know from eBay and Instagram as Mad Mercantile. He's a super cool guy. He sells both vintage and modern. And then we have Travis Young, who's more my age, and he's going to be talking about sort of the same stuff, but also, and he does found pen repair.
Cool.
And so, we're trying to avoid the kind of getting into the granularity of like finding every clip design that Schaefer had for the balance, like we're talking more about like just purely trying to encourage people to experience these things. What I would say before we get to PenBoyRoy's question is, like if you like The Crown, right? The Crown on Netflix is a great show for fountain pens. And if you like looking at Queen Elizabeth writing notes to people and the way her notes look in the pens, that's because she's using vintage pens with the vintage nibs. And, the ink is probably made down the road in Manchester. Do you mean? But like if you want to kind of capture that, go try some vintage pens. And I could tell you, if you like, broader, like I don't really like fine or extra fine nibs. So for me, I end up gravitating towards British pens because they tend to have broader nibs. Just something that's out there, right? But you can get some, like there's a Parker Duofold model that's made out of plastic. It's a 14K nib. They come in different sizes, from a little like vest or purse size all the way up to like a senior. They have like kind of like the arometric filler. What it's made out of is super durable. They generally work well. And you could start writing with this thing right away. And it's a pen from the 50s. And I have a bunch of them because I love it. But
nice. So
there's models like that out there, right? And, helping people find those things is part of like what I'd like to help them do, So anyway, ask your question, sir.
Yeah, I like the desire that you have. Like I see what you're trying to do, and I like it. I think that at some point, if somebody's mind was closed off to the whole vintage pen thing, I think that opening your mind to it, or just being open to the idea of it, is a very good start. Conversely, realize that there will be risk involved. And for me, half the times the risk wasn't worth it, and half the times it was. But for the times that it was, it's like a real, it's a score. It's really cool. It's a good feeling, and I do appreciate that. My question is, you talk about the need for people not to let the ways of the old and the vintage pens die. right? You mentioned that earlier, like these things,
Yeah.
these guys are going away because they're getting older and everything like that. And we don't want them to be forgotten. I'm with you on that. But what is your opinion about the need for vintage pens for the future of just the fountain pen industry as a whole?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So, what I'm talking about is like a body of knowledge about these things, right? Like, for example, everyone always asks, and I deal with nibs, so I part of this conversation regularly. Why can't anyone make vintage flex style nibs, right? Well, it can be done, right? Because what that was a matter of the alloy, the tempering, and the shaping, right?
Hmm.
The problem is that whoever knew what that alloy was didn't tell anyone outside a pen company.
Mm.
And so maybe in the archives of watermen that are now in France or wherever they are, if they even exist anymore, because they could have been just shredded, that information may exist somewhere in somebody's file or it may not, and it went into the sands of time, right? And so there's things like that for the industry that would be great to know because, watermen themselves, maybe they have this secret and it's a juicy secret, right? And you say, well, why wouldn't they tell anyone? Well, who knows why? We can't get into their mind. But maybe there's another company that if they had that, they would make the investment in mixing the alloys, doing the shaping, and things like that. If that knowledge was readily available, right? Because now, right, what we're talking about is, well, now someone has to sort of start from scratch. They have to get gold, which is expensive. They have to start to play with different alloys, and I'm sure those people can do it. And then they have to make the tooling and the dyes and the cutting and all this stuff. And at the end of it, right, it's a tremendous investment, which may have been cut short if that information was something like readily available, right?
Right. So I
So
completely agree with the example that you just
yeah,
gave because
it's
nowadays
it's deliberately chosen.
modern fountain pens cannot emulate the flexing wet noodle experience of 1910 with all the
Yeah,
technology, and me and Tom talk about it all the time, with all the technology that we have, with being able to look at something on your cell phone to fact check something someone just said to you 10 seconds ago. With all this and being able to make all kinds of modern machines and advanced technology, we can't seem to emulate it. And I definitely think you're right. It's because the guy in 1910 who knew how to make it didn't tell the next guy. And then over time, we lost that formula, that recipe for an awesome flex nib. And with this example in particular, yes, 100%. This is why we need to know the methods of the guys before us. But outside of the flex nib, because the
yeah.
flex nib situation already happened, what do you think can be gained in the future of fountain pens through vintage pens now, other than the flex nib situation?
I mean, so I guess going with well, there's a few things. One is there is a historical value, right? So there's like an intellectual part of me that says like we need to do this, and that is really more of a value system than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem that I think the fountain pen industry could face at some point is two or threefold, right? One is people just tire out because there is like a degree of sameness, which is not necessarily a problem. But like I'm going through pens right now because I have too many pens. I need to like declutter a little bit. And I can remember why I bought things at the time, but like I'm also looking at it, I'm saying, well, when am I ever going to re-ink this thing up when I have this thing? And I'm talking specifically within like different colorways of the same model or something like that. And so as the market matures, so to speak, is there a point where people tire out, and to keep the fountain pen community and the fountain pen industry going, we need something else? And rather than having to reinvent the wheel on the whole body of pens that exist from before the 90s, wouldn't it be great if we were able to preserve to the biggest extent possible all of this so we can keep our community thriving forever because people can just kind of bounce back and forth, right? Because the idea, right, is like some days you want to pick up your Bennu because your Bennu is crazy and awesome and you can stare at it and things like that. And some days you want to pick up, your Waterman 94 because it gives you just a little bit of bounce when you're taking notes and, and then when you're going to a meeting, you want your Mont Blanc 149 because you think it's going to stand out. Or, like to be able to have that variety to keep it like a healthy community, I think is somewhat necessary. And I think that also like people's entry into it can be satisfied with these things too, right? Like a big part of things that did not exist when I started in fountain pens is like the dynamics of like Instagram and the visual nature of us taking these tools and like making it a visual experience as opposed to a solely like user or tactile experience is like kind of like what they were conceived of, right? In some ways, right? Like there's like a whole world of vintage pens. Like if you love like Jonathan Brooks or Turnt Pen Company or any of these people or Narwhal that are doing these wild materials, like go online and Google vintage Conway Stewart and just like see what they did in celluloid, where like you'd have like green and red with like gold metallic veins, like, and just think, and I'm not saying to buy one necessarily, but, take a look at it and just see like, what it was when someone wanted a super colorful pen back before we had like acrylics and Alumilite and stuff like that. What did you do? What did you have? Because like there's things that there's like these cross hatches and things like that. So so I don't know. I mean, to me that's where the long run comes in, right? Like it's a historical thing, but two, like it keeps our ecosystem going that you can.
Right.
This thing in so many different ways.
I definitely think that's a very good point because right now, yes, the current modern market is saturated with so many products. And because there's so many similarities between them that a person can experience burnout, right? Yeah. But to escape that burnout, but stay within the hobby, you have the vintage market that you can actually kind of go to get refreshed because, as simple as this pen may be, it is a refreshing pen. Yeah. And another example of to your point, JJ, is the odd oink. Like he wouldn't buy a modern Mont Blanc 146, but he would buy a vintage one for half the price, and he did, right? Yeah. So I see what you're saying because like there's so many Mont Blancs out there, they're all the same, but there's uniqueness and value in the vintage, and he struck gold on that one too. Like,
well, I also think of the analogy of movies. So if you could imagine going to want to watch a movie, but you're only limited to watching movies made in the last decade.
Yeah.
And that's all that you had access to for the next however many years that you watch movies. And you get tired of it because Hollywood at this point is, it's more of the same. It's just things are very similar. If they do reboots, everything kind of has a similar feel to it. But they told stories differently back in, 50, 60, 70 years ago. The stories were, but you would see very similar to how the development of fountain pens have gone. You could see roots of what is being produced now in what was being produced before. And some things just stand the test of time and that you could come back to, watch it another 15 years from now and still feel that, it still holds originality. It still has its unique, distinct flair that just cannot be modernized or cannot be replicated in a current piece of work. So that's like my example for it is my Parker Vacuumatic. I love Vacuumatics. There's nothing that comes close, I feel, to the Vacuumatic experience. I mean, the material, the filling mechanism, the shape and size of it. Like I bought a whole bunch of them. I just kept one. I have one right now, and that's like my sole vintage pen that I have in my really nice 10 pen lineup. And I will not give that up for pretty much anything because it is something that is a one of a kind and just seems to stand a test of time because there's really nothing that has come at all recently that can replicate it.
No. You know, it's funny, you bring up the movie thing, and
Yeah.
I'll give you an example of a movie. Like, I've watched hundreds of movies with my wife. The most memorable, I guess, like movie watching with my wife that sticks out was the first one I think of, Sound of Music. We've watched The Avengers, we've watched all these movies that are modern and stuff, but I remember the most watching Sound of Music with her years ago.
Yeah.
You know, so I definitely can relate to what you're talking about in terms of how vintage can be a refreshing experience when you're so saturated in modern tech and all that kind of stuff. And when I say modern tech, I'm not talking about iPhones and stuff. I'm talking about the modern tech of making modern technical fountain pens that are machined and stuff like that. I do see how it can be refreshing. But at the same time, it does come with a moderate risk that I think you have to be real with people about and say, yeah, you are going to lose money at some point, or you're going to have to spend more money at some point. But there's also going to be the time where you're going to strike gold.
Yeah, I mean, yes. And look, you know, it's all a matter of personal preference, right? And personal choice and what your appetite is for this stuff, right? Like, I'll tell you, like, I have this is a Maybe Todd. It's called a self filler. It's a leverless. So it has
you gotta hold it in front.
Sorry.
You
You see it there?
That's good,
Yeah, I'm
right
trying
there.
to do it with, my camera. All right, look at that. All right. This was my first striking gold, right? I saw this on eBay. It's chased, which means that, like, it's ebonite and they use like a hot dye and like press into it to give it texture. And I'm all about like matte finish and stuff like that. And it had this like oblique stub that I didn't even really understand when I got it because I was so new to things. And I inked it up, arrived and didn't need a new sack. I don't think I've ever changed the sack in it. And it started writing. It was like super wet and awesome, and it just was like a totally different thing. And I started getting pens in like 2008, 2009, 2010. Like, there was a lot of stuff on the market because the economy had tanked and people were unloading stuff. So I tried a bunch of stuff and just like nothing was like this. So when you hit on that one experience, it's like the Sound of Music, or, you know, something you know, remember, you know, for a long time. And yeah, you're going to have some misses, but like, I would submit to everybody that if you looked at your collection of modern pens, you would feel the same way about something at some point. You know, there's just like something that just seemed like it would work, but just misses the mark in some way.
Visconti. You know? Yeah. So,
ooh, what?
Anyway, listen,
Yeah.
this has been a very interesting. I appreciate you sharing your perspective because it's a perspective that I'm certainly willing to be open to. I think I think I started I dabbled in vintage. I don't have plans, or I didn't have plans to dabble more into vintage, but it's something I'm certainly open to because of this conversation that we had. And reservations aside, I do want to experience that striking gold like I did with my Schaefer balance. And it is something that I am open to, and I hope that everybody listening can also be open to. And by being open, I'm not saying go out and just start dropping money on eBay. I'm saying, you know what, the next time you go to a show, instead of just walking past the vintage table, take a look at the vintage table, learn about it, read about it. There's nothing better than learning and reading and researching something that you have interest in, especially if it's about a hobby that you're already engaged in, right? So there's no risk in learning about it. So I'm with you on this one. I'm with you on this one, JJ. I do appreciate your perspective and sharing it with us, and I'm sure everybody else is. I'd like to know what everybody else thinks. Write in, Pentertainment Podcast at gmail.com. That's all we have for you today. Thank you for joining us for episode number 172. JJ, thanks for being on. Very interesting discussion.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So that's all we have for you. Love you guys. Be well. Be safe.
All right.
Stay inky.
Later.